Welcome, everyone. It's so great to see you all here. I know many have traveled across the country, across the Atlantic, and across the Pacific to be here with us today for our annual symposium. And this is actually the third symposium in New York. So we're really thrilled to be here in this beautiful space. I'm Alexandra Mousavizadeh, and here's Annabel, Ayles, and we are the co-founders of Evident. And we, just for those of you who don't know us, we are an intelligence platform, and we specialize in benchmarking and tracking AI adoption across the financial services. And we do so in a number of ways, in the three ways that you can see on the screen. So we do so by running our public ranking for banks and insurance companies now, also which we launched in June this year. We also do that through our benchmarking, private benchmark, where we're looking at AI spend, use cases, and return on investment. And then throughout the year, we produce insights and research reports and an enormous amount of trackers that look at everything to do with AI adoption in financial services. Maybe before going on to mention that we set up Evident about 4 years ago, after a handful of years focusing on the measurement of the strength of AI national ecosystems, so looking at how nations were performing on their AI capabilities. And with the growing innovations in that space back 4 years ago, and also meeting the demand of the growing questions from particularly the banks on looking to see if we could adapt that methodology to see how the banks were performing on their AI adoption vis-a-vis peers. So that was sort of really the starting point for setting up Evident. But we also try and create a platform that creates more transparency in AI adoption, to really be able to see what others are doing, what are the best practices, and at the end of the day, to help accelerate the AI adoption in the financial services. So maybe also just to mention that this is our coverage, as you can see. We have focused on ranking the 50 largest banks in North America and Europe, and the 30 largest insurers in North America and Europe. But we are expanding, and we are expanding our coverage next year to cover financial services in Asia, in the Middle East, in Latin America, and in Africa. But we're also going to be expanding some of our coverage across other verticals in financial services. We're going to do a payment platform index soon. We're also going to be ranking asset managers. We are also going to go deeper into the banks and look at mapping lines of business such as capital markets, investment banking, and so on. And so we're not only expanding, but we're also going deeper. That's our plan for next year. But we thought we would just spend maybe some minutes on looking at the results of the recently released 2025 ranking of the 50 largest banks, and look at what are the trends that we're seeing. And it certainly has been the biggest ramp up we've seen since we started mapping the banks. Unprecedented growth across all of the areas that we track. We look at the pillars you can see on the screen. We look at 4 pillars. We look at AI talent. We look at all of the innovation levers that the banks are pulling on research, on patents, on investments into AI companies, and so on. We look at leadership in terms of the narratives of the bank, and we look at the transparency of responsible AI. And everything's gone up and to the right in these categories that we look at. We're going to look at that on the next slide. But maybe before going there, just to say that this unprecedented growth across all of the sector, really, but really the 10 top banks have been growing at double the pace of the average of the index, and very much led, as you know, by JP Morgan and Capital One, that are really out front and growing at a tremendous speed in their activities, both in terms of what we're looking at here, which are investments into the capabilities that are really showing that flywheel effect of getting use cases into production and the hiring and so on that follows that. But just to take a look at some of the data points here, and as you can see on the screen, these are sort of the categories that we capture. But on talent itself, so we look at the talent pools in the bank that are related to AI that focus on getting the use cases from ideation to production. And that talent pool has grown by more than 25% across the banks. And that's a huge ramp up, much bigger than we've ever seen before. Of course, we look carefully at sort of the what are the banks hiring and for what, and we'll get into that later on. And also on the innovation side, as I said, we look at research and patents and partnerships and investments, but just looking at the research activity as one of the things to pull out, that has also really ramped up. And 38 of the 50 banks now have some form of an AI research entity. Applied AI research is really the focus, and really fanning that capability out into the functions and the lines of the business in the banks. And that has really helped accelerate a lot of the deployment. But also on the leadership side, a huge increase in just the visibility of what the banks are doing in terms of rollout of use cases, associated outcomes and return on investment of those use cases. We've seen that ramping up again this year. And also on transparency of the responsible AI side, most banks now have some leadership that is responsible for the responsible AI rollout and what governs the bank on that front. We're going to get more into the details, and I'm going to hand over to Annabel.
Thank you. So as Alexandra said, we've seen an incredible ramp up in activity in all of those capability areas. So a real ramp up in investments. But in parallel, we've also started seeing those investments really translate into use cases and into business impact. So if you look at this slide, it just pulls out some of the metrics that we look at. On the first two columns, this is where we're looking at use cases. And what you can see is that 32 out of the 50 banks that we track are now disclosing at least some sort of use cases in production that are delivering a financial business impact. It's also interesting that there are 18 that still haven't. On the second part, you can see that 25 banks now have gone one step further and disclosed a total number of use cases in production across their organizations. So that's really a doubling from what we saw the year before. And all of that is to say that we're seeing these use cases move into production, but also more centralized tracking of where these use cases are in these large, complex organizations. And that's becoming increasingly centralized. And then on the right-hand side of this chart, these numbers are a bit smaller, but this is where we're really tracking the banks that are disclosing the aggregate ROI across all of their use cases. So 7 banks in the last year have disclosed their returns targets, their overall target return that they're expecting from AI. And 4 have disclosed the realized value, i.e. the value that has been delivered from AI to date. And these numbers are still small. Many banks still aren't choosing to disclose this publicly. But I think this is all signs that all of this investment is beginning to translate into use cases in production and ultimately business value too. So on this slide, we actually look at the kind of correlation between all of those investments, i.e. the index score. So the x-axis here is the bank's score in the index. And the y-axis is then the number of AI use cases that they've disclosed. And over the past few years, we've been tracking this, and we're just seeing an increasingly strong correlation between performance in all of those investment areas and the number of use cases that are sort of moving into production. Obviously, JPMC on the top right of this chart leading the pack. And I think what that shows is that these banks that are ahead on talent, the ones that have invested in sort of attracting all of this AI and data talent, the banks that have a very strong innovation strategy where they can build capabilities in-house, but also partner with vendors and buy those capabilities when they need to. The banks with strong leadership, a top-down CEO focus on AI, and finally banks with very strong AI governance. All of that is beginning to translate into deployment and impact. So we've talked a bit about outcomes, and I guess the question really is, where are the use cases? What are these use cases that we're talking about? Evident tracks these on a monthly basis. We track all of the use cases that are announced by the 50 banks and the 30 insurers that we track. And this is just focused on the banks specifically. But in the last 12 months, we've seen 110 generative or agentic use cases be announced externally. The vast majority of these are still generative AI internally facing use cases. So employee facing, not in the hands of customers. The dark blue chart on this slide, a lot of these are in knowledge access, so making sort of internal insights available to employees, process automation, so reducing the amount of time on manual work or document summarization, and also in developer augmentation too. The externally facing Gen AI use cases are still relatively few and far between, but perhaps unsurprisingly, most of these are in customer engagement. In retail banking, for example, the customer-facing chatbots. We've seen more banks announce these over the last year, but we've also seen a growing sophistication of these chatbots. So more multimodal, maybe even avatars at play. And most of this is in retail, but we are also starting to see those customer-facing chatbots in wealth management and even on investment banking too. And finally, on this slide, we've looked at agents, right? And I guess that's the orange bar. And in the last year, we've had 19 sort of instances of agentic use cases being announced across the 50 banks. We saw 5 of these in September alone, so we're just seeing this pace really accelerate. And those use cases have only been disclosed by 12 banks, 12 out of 50. So it's still nascent. A lot of these use cases are in testing phases. They're not really necessarily in production, but it's just yet another sign that the leading banks are continuing to innovate and drive forward, and those that aren't are going to fall increasingly behind. And then finally, if we've talked about the use cases, maybe we just look at the overall financial value that banks are seeing from AI today. So these are the sort of 9 banks that have disclosed either realized or projected estimates of total financial value from AI. They range from sort of more in the $100 million territory up to $2 billion, JPMC obviously leading the way here. And I guess maybe a few things to note is that a lot of these metrics are still traditional AI dominant. So sometimes generative AI, those calculations of ROI are harder to calculate, so they're not necessarily included yet. A lot of these numbers are also driven by cost reduction and also cost avoidance. But we are beginning to see some of more sort of revenue generating figures being released and revenue uplift figures. And then maybe the final thing just to say is that I think these numbers are still relatively small. I think that maybe that's not a surprise for those of us that are working day in, day out in getting these use cases into production. We're definitely expecting it to ramp up, but we're still in the foothills, we think, of what the transformative value of AI is really going to look like. But that's where we are today.
Thanks. And then, and of course, what is disclosed is only the tip of the iceberg, as we know. We're going to dive into a very packed and rich agenda in a minute, and we'll kick off soon. But maybe just some of the topics, we call them hot topics, that we speak to many of you in the room on a daily basis, and there's only so much that the data can tell us, and there's sort of a lot of the conversations that we're having on sort of what's top of mind. And some of the things that we're seeing, of course, is this, as we're shifting from a phase of testing and early deployment, there's been a sort of a focus on trying many things and sort of seeing where all of the areas in the bank that Gen AI could be tested and used, but sort of a real concentration on focusing on what's really generating that impact and sort of narrowing it down and try and not go into areas that are and can be distracting. So we're sort of really focusing, we're seeing that focus. And then in addition, of course, everyone's talking about the scale and how are we going to do, the AI at scale and looking at sort of that complete transformation and looking at workflows and the full transformation of multi-step and longer workflows. And so driving that scalability through and ease with which we're seeing use cases moving into production is trying to deal with the fragmentation within the banks in terms of having many platforms for developers, but also maybe not full oversight of all of the use cases there are. So this sort of focus on centralization in order to monitor better and in order also to create systems for reusability of use cases that, again, brings that time to production down, very top of mind. But then also this demonstration of ROI, obviously early days. Lots of predictions are flying around when we're going to see this really hit the bottom line, probably 27, agentic AI maybe later. But the demonstration of ROI without being too short-termistic, if that's a word, and really thinking about the long-term transformation of the bank, monitoring what is working, but also maturing these ROI frameworks is something that's also, we know, very top of mind, and we'll be discussing that a lot today. And of course, sort of figuring out, avoiding vendor lock-in, figuring out what vendors to work with, what models to use for what particular problems, large language models, small language models, but also starting to move into building proprietary AI capabilities in the banks. And last, of course, not least, agents. Everyone's talking about agents. It's really early days. We're going to be spending time on that also today. Some are really thinking about what sort of that integration readiness that's needed in order to build these agentic AI workflows. And as Annabel was saying, things are being disclosed. It's still really early days in this phase. So not only moving from a deterministic agentic AI, use cases to sort of fully autonomous, and we're not there yet. We'll obviously get there, and it will be very transformative, of course. So much to discuss. Really looking forward to getting into all of that today and having everyone here. And of course, before I hand over to the next session, wanted to say a very big thank you to our headline partner, EY, and all of our other supporting partners as well, because without you, this would not be possible. And we thank you very much. We're going to stop here and hope everyone has a really good day and lots of conversations on stage and off stage as well. And I'm going to hand over to Caroline Hyde from Bloomberg and Teresa from JP Morgan to continue the tradition of them opening the symposium. Thank you very much.